All right, so I'm going to talk about relationship elements in the new RDA. But before we dive deep, I want to spend a little time on the surface. Let's talk about relationships in general, which is a concept we should all understand. Relationships connect to things. So Kate has employer, Library of Congress. Relationships are inherently reciprocal. So I can flip my previous statement around and say that Library of Congress has employee Kate. And relationships help identify one thing by defining its relationship to another. So I'm the Kate that has employer Library of Congress. I'm not the Kate that has employer NBC. That Kate is Kate McKinnon, who is on Saturday Night Live. She is awesome. Relationships can be expressed many different ways. We could use a graph to express my previous statement. We could use an RDF triple, and just FYI, I'm showing you a very simplified data model statement for the RDF triple. I'm not giving you the URIs because it's more meaningful to us human beings to see that, but you can imagine URIs behind the scenes there. I can use an RDA relationship element, Kate, employer, Library of Congress. All of these are saying the same thing with a slightly different presentation. And even though I specifically flagged the second bullet as an RDF triple, in fact, there really are RDF triples. Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I'm sure a lot of you here are very familiar with the concept of RDF triples. If you're not, don't worry. Just know that RDF triples data can be stored in a variety of formats like RDF, XML, JSON, LD, for publishing on the web. You don't have to know any of those to understand the data model. You don't need to read the W3C documentation to use the new RDA. Just understand this high-level concept, and that's enough to understand RDA relationship elements. So here's some terminology that I took from the new RDA that is useful in understanding relationship elements. My colleagues have talked to you about entities, so I won't go over that again. Remember, we have a lot of entities specifically designed in RDA, and a relationship element specifically relates to RDA entities. The domain of a relationship element is the entity that's described by that element, and the range is the entity that is the value of a relationship element. I'll show you a little bit of that on a slide that's coming up. So hold that thought if you're thinking, what? There are some characteristics of relationship elements that make them easily identifiable in the new RDA. They have a domain and a range entity listed. Of course, the value recorded represents the range entity. Sometimes multiple recording methods are available to record the value for the range entity. The reason I say sometimes is because there's this entity that can be the range entity that's a little bit different than many of the others. It's called Nomen. You remember Gordon's presentation, and then Thomas's presentation followed up that very nicely by talking about appellation elements. So we've got names, which that's an unstructured description. We've got access points, it's a structured description. We've got identifiers, which are identifiers as a recording method. So if the range is a nomen, it works a bit differently than if the range is, say, a place. Then finally, Remember how I said that in general relationships are inherently reciprocal? So when it comes to RDA, relationship elements have a corresponding inverse relationship. So let's see how that works in practice. So on the left-hand side, I have some reference for you. I've got the label for the element, and I've listed the domain and range. And then on the right-hand side, show you how it works when you've got data to record. So for the element related agent of work, the domain is work, the range is agent. So I end up with domain of great expectations, right? It's the title of the work. And then my range, Charles Dickens, it's the agent. I'm using names, titles to represent a value for that entity. Now, remember how I said, oh, relationships are inherently reciprocal? Here it is. I can also say related work of agent, which has domain agent, range work. So we just flip that around from the previous element. So I have Charles Dickens as my domain, and I have great expectations as my range. Then I can record another element, place of birth, domain person, range place, becomes Charles Dickens is the domain, range is Portsmouth, England. Obviously, I can flip that around again, but as we know, there's probably a lot of people that were born in Portsmouth, England, so maybe it's not as interesting to record the inverse relationship in that case. So how do I figure out what's the domain and range of any relationship element? There's a couple of different ways. The first and best way is to consult the element reference box, and I'll show you what that looks like on the next slide. There's also other clues to be found in other parts of RDA. The range entity appears first in the RDA glossary definition, if you're looking at that. But say you're not even looking inside RDA toolkit, but you're looking at the RDA registry, there's a definition pattern, and that pattern is relates a domain entity to a glossary definition. And then, as I explained before, the glossary definition probably contains the range entity. So if you know this structure, you can parse it out. Another clue that has really helped me is to use verbalized labels, and I'll explain what those are in a minute. So let's take a look at the first and best and easiest way to determine the domain and range. We look at the box. So all I have to do is just click to expand, and it tells me that the domain for data publication is manifestation, and the range is time span. So a date's a time span. This was very easy. I didn't have to do a lot of if A, then B. So I highly recommend you use this method. But when you're bopping around the toolkit, sometimes you're not in the page for the element. You might be in the glossary. So relationship elements are all defined in the glossary, along with many other RDA terms. Here's an example of a relationship element, and sorry, I should say, these obviously, even though of course I was working until the very last minute, I didn't do the entire presentation last night, and a few things changed from the time I started the presentation until yeah, I finished the presentation, and one of them was these particular labels. This is still easy enough for you to understand the point, but if you, after this presentation, if you go look in the toolkit, you'll see there's some differences now, and that's why, because They changed on Friday. So anyway, but back to the presentation. So here's the definition of the relationship element, director. And this is a relationship element. Yes, we know, people can be directors, that can be their profession, but in this context, it's an RDA relationship element. So I've got the range entity, it's an agent. Now I'm going to look at another glossary definition, which is a specific type of director, a film director, and I don't have the ranged entity of agent. Instead, it's pointing me to director, but I can still infer back to the fact that the range would be agent, because if the range of director is agent, then the range of film director should logically be agent. There's no perfect solution for how to construct these definitions. The RSC made a deliberate choice here for these narrower relationship elements to use the label for the higher relationship element. That reinforces the hierarchy. It lets you know where you are. You can It's also nice to have the range entity right there, but we can't have everything. Not a problem, because, as I just said before, this is not the easiest and best way to determine the domain and range of an element. If you go to the page for the narrower element, it'll be right there in the element reference box. All right, the RDA registry, which is another thing I discussed. Some of you are probably very familiar with it. Some of you are like, what? So it's a website. It's freely available, which we all like as librarians. We love free. So feel free to check it out. The RDA registry has the terms for current RDA that everyone is using now. It doesn't have the new RDA definitions. So obviously, at some point when the RDA board and the RSC approve the new text, the registry will be updated, but right now it's showing you the old, original RDA. That's because that's the one that people are using. So just keep this in mind as a future useful method for determining domain and range of relationship elements. So I've broken it out. I don't know how well these colors are appearing on the slide, but for this element has member, it relates a corporate body. Notice the term relates. That's a domain. And then you can see highlighted in green the whole toolkit definition. And then within that definition, I've got the range entity person. Using the verbalized labels. You just saw an example of that in the previous slide. Verbalized labels have verbs in them, has and is. Verbs are our friends in communication. They're available in the RDA registry, and now they've become integrated into the toolkit in the element reference box. You might even be able to make an understandable sentence with them. So, work has preferred title of work nomen. Yeah, I realize that that's not very understandable, but when I start to fill in some values, work has preferred title of work Hamlet. Now I've got something. Person has date of birth time span. What does that mean? Amy Tan has date of birth 1952. Ah, yeah, that makes sense. These are verbalized labels that are actually pretty good English. Some of them are a bit more difficult to parse out, certainly for the end user. Eventually, for catalogers, it will become second nature, and you'll have something that's understandable to catalogers, but I agree, it might not be something you want to show your end user. So I'll put understandable in quotes as understandable to catalogers. These verbalized labels are listed in the alternate labels section of the RDA toolkit in the element reference box. We have some others. So here's two examples. And then there's a different kind called former label. So the element in the beta toolkit is called related place of corporate body. You probably know it better as place associated with corporate body. It's still listed as an alternate label. All of those labels listed as alternate labels are available for use if you prefer those to the one that we have chosen to name the element. Former labels are not automatically added. They're done if there's deemed a significant change to the label. And if you're wondering, what is significant? You'd have to ask Gordon. In my ideal world, we would list them all, but now I'm going to take a little bit of a right turn. Remember how I said, oh yeah, when I was doing this presentation, some things changed. They changed because of our WEMI, which stands for Work, Expression, Manifestation, and Item, to Agent, Entity, Relationship Elements, Breakout. So in more plain English, that means we had a lot of relationship elements defined with domain agent or range agent, and then we've kept those, but then we've expanded that to the subtypes of agents. So we now have a lot more relationship elements. If you're wondering, what are the agent subtypes? The first three should be very familiar to you. Person, family, corporate body. We've been using those for a long time. The other one, collective agent, might not be so familiar. Collective agents are families and corporate bodies. So that's just, it's a subtype of agent in itself, and it's a, it's a shorthand way of saying family and corporate body. So if the relationship element was applicable to each of the entity subtypes, we originally had it just defined at the agent level. So creator of work has range agent. But with this relationship elements breakout, we now have them defined explicitly for each subtype. So creator person of work, notice the difference in label, has range person. So why did we do this to you? It's not like there weren't enough elements already. Believe it or not, it was actually meant to help you. Think of it as eating your Brussels sprouts. So before the breakout, if I wanted to relate Anne Rice to Interview with the Vampire, I'm going to look in the toolkit. Let's think about what I know. Obviously, I know Anne Rice is a person. I know Interview with the Vampire is a work. So I'm going to look in the person entity page, that list of relationship of elements available to me for person, wait a minute, I know Anne Rice is the author of Interview with the Vampire, but I don't see author of in this list. Why not? That's because it was at the agent entity page list. So I might not have even realized I could do this. I might have just, tossed my hands and been like, oh, well, RDA doesn't work for me anymore. If I can't do a simple thing like relate a person to a work. So here's what's going to happen now. I want to relate Anne Rice to Interview with the Vampire. I know Anne Rice is a person. I go to the person entity page and look at the relationship elements list, and author person of is on the list. So my problem is solved. Anne Rice is author person of Interview with the Vampire. Another reason why we did this were technical issues that may be less applicable to your personal work, but are important to the RDA community in general. TQM has been total quality management. Sorry, it's mark of quality. It's been a long conference, all right? It's the importance of the unique Newman string. So total mark of quality has been working with new RDA elements to develop room 4, and they've said that it's difficult to create a script that instantiates a specific collective agent, etc., relationships in the RIM input forms when they're only defined at that agent level. So they need to have it defined at the specific entity level for all of those subtypes in order to easily generate the input forms. We're lucky with the English language that it is often gender neutral, but translators of RDA, depending on what language they work in, have had a lot of problems translating our relationship elements when they need to have both male and female terms for persons. So we realized that in order to make it RDA easily translatable for them, we were probably going to have to explicitly define all of these person relationship elements, so it makes sense to do it for all of them. And finally, it's going to support future application profiles because the Giant framework is already there to develop your own application profile rather than you having to try and break out those agent relationships to the subtypes and trying to map those. And if you're still not convinced, I understand. The number of elements seems overwhelming. When I was first told about this, I'm like, what? It's big enough already. Yeah, it can seem overwhelming. But remember, new RDA is all about making the choices that work for your data needs. You don't have to use all of these elements just because they're there. Pick what works, pick the level that works for you, pick the elements that work for you. One policy statement becomes 5 policy statements now. Yes, this is true potentially. So policy statement writers are going to have some work cut out for them, but it's not as bad as we think it is because of technical solutions that are provided in the content management system that policy statement writers and the RFC uses for the RDA text. So it's a technique, it's called boilerplate, where basically we can reuse the same text over and over again without having to type 5 different times. You might be thinking, where does it end? The hierarchy with agent subtypes isn't the same as a hierarchy with specific role. And so you might remember the famous writer of recipes example that was proposed as a designator in the old days, and it was just, just seems way too specific. How often do we want to use that? So doing this with agents doesn't mean we're going to go down that level of specificity. Where does it end specifically with the roles? That's not an answer that I have for you right now. That's an answer for the RSC to consider. It is certainly one that has been kept in mind, and there is a desire not to have an endless set of elements to maintain, but I can't give you a 2 or 3 sentence easy answer to that. So, as you've probably been hearing me say, I haven't used the word designator except when referring to the original toolkit. This is something we've been saying with the 3R project in many different presentations, but some of you might not have heard it yet. So just as a reminder, relationship designators are relationship elements. Remember, in the original toolkit, relationship designators were in a lot of different places. They were listed completely in the appendix. They were touched on in different chapters, but it's hard to figure out exactly how they were characterized. They seem to be a refinement of a relationship element. So creator is a relationship element. A composer is a type of creator, sure. But the relationship element chapters didn't specifically discuss them. So what were they? It's kind of a nebulous answer in original RDA toolkit, but in the RDA registry, it seems so clear. Creator is a relationship element. Said before, a composer is a type of creator. Therefore, composer is a relationship element. We can all follow the logic of that. There was a member of CCDA who's recently retired named Diane Hillman, and when she was helping with the RDA registry, she realized this instantly before most of us. And it seemed like, what are you talking about, Diane? No, that's crazy talk. And as I lay it out here, it seems so logical and obvious. I don't know why it took us so long to get to this point with the 3R, but thank you, Diane. That has solved a lot of problems. So the former designators are elements in the new RDA toolkit. They are equal to any other kind of element. I hope that they will actually be easier for you to find because they're not just banished to those long sets of appendices. They are listed on the entity page. They each have their own page. Each of them is listed in the glossary. And the final point that I wanted to make about relationship elements, and this goes back to, in part, to why do we have so many of them, because some attributes from the original toolkit have become relationship elements. Why is that? We have new entities, nomen and time span. It turns several attributes into relationship elements. So title, work, and date of birth were attributes in the original toolkit. Now they're relationships, as you saw with my Amy Tan example. Further development of the place entity also turned attributes into relationship elements. Place of death, and also in turning these attributes into relationship elements, a lot of them have been renamed to include both entities, so it might actually be a little easier to find some of them. So date associated with person has now become related time span of person. Place associated with corporate body is now related place of corporate body. So remember that if you type it in and you don't find it at first, try some different things. But these should be listed in the alternate labels, so you should be able to find them in that element reference box and with doing an all search. I hope you find this presentation relatable. So who can resist a bad pun? So, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Kate. Are there any questions for Kate? One of the usual suspects.
You mentioned the equal status of relationships being taken out from the old toolkit to a new toolkit counterparts. Does the same also apply to verbalized and non-verbalized labels?
Are you asking if there's any kind of signal of preference by the fact that one is at the top and one is in the alternates?
Well, I'm asking in terms of the relationship matrix, the labels used in there do not include the verbs. Whereas in the element references, you do get references to verbalized versions of that. So does that denote any form of preference between the two, or is that just
It's a matter of convenience.
Okay.
Yes, it's a matter of convenience. I mean, trying to reproduce having just one label at the top of the page makes things easier for people to understand and find them. Imagine trying to list 5 labels at the top of the page. That's one reason to pick one of them. They're trying to reproduce all of those labels in the relationship matrix. It's already, difficult to understand how the matrix operates. So yeah, I just think that would quickly become untenable. But in terms of is the RSC trying to give you a hint about which label you should use? Again, it's, as we've said over and over again, RDA is full of options that are presented to you to make the best choices for your community. No, pick the label that works for your community. And I personally love the verbalized labels. I think that they make it easier to understand. I think that there's a lot of machine actionability with them to turn into statements for users. So
I'd agree. I think having the verb in the label is very useful in terms of avoiding ambiguity. I think Kate has employer LC is immediately more apparent the nature of that relationship rather than Kate's employer LC.
Right. Just reading that as a statement, it's like, well, I could understand how people think, well, are you trying to say it's employer is my profession or occupation? What are you saying with that?
Let me just add that what we decided to do in the toolkit was to use the element name at the top of the page and then the relationship matrix, and so that's why the alternate labels are presented as such. We sort of standardized on the element name.
Bob Maxwell, I have a kind of a practical question. Now that everything's all together and equal, all the elements are together. I haven't examined the new toolkit as closely, obviously, as you have, but it seems to me that it may not always be obvious that it's a relationship element and not another kind of element. So what are is a clue that we're dealing with a relationship element that it's in the relationship matrix, for instance, or how can I tell that this is a relationship element versus some other sort of element?
Okay, let me go back to the beginning. Relationship elements have a domain and a range entity, and those entities are RDA entities.
So my clue is going to be that another kind of element doesn't show a domain in the range.
Right. Every element in the every element has an element reference box to help you out. I want to say every, but if there isn't, it's a hiccup to be fixed. There's a domain for every element. Not every element has a range entity listed. That's how you know the difference. So let's take
elements will all have a range and no other ones will.
So I'm looking at Gordon because I'm thinking about some things we discussed, but yes. So let me take an example of, a non-relationship element, language of expression. Okay, so the domain is expression. The language of expression describes the expression. What would be the range? Like, English. What kind of RDA entity does that conform to? When it's a term that's being used for a language, it doesn't. So it's not a relationship element.
Okay, well, that's useful to know. I think people who know presentations like this might think, oh, I can make a relationship to a language because language is a set of terms. And so I'm just, my comment is simply, it needs to be made much more crystal clear when it's a relationship element, rather than just say, well, if it has a range, then it is a relationship element. Because theoretically, people like me would like to say, oh, I can record a relationship and make an authority record or something like that. So it's useful for you to point that piece of information.
Right, and the RSC is looking at tools with, I'm sure Jamie will talk about that there might be additional clues to help you with that. But I want to pick up on something you said, Bob, about, people might think I can make a relationship with language of expression. Well, that's the beauty of linked data. It's very easy to make relationships, and it's compliant with RDA to have, an RDF triple involving language of expression. That's perfectly fine. So you can be making relationships with your data just because you don't have a relationship element if you're using the right reporting method.
Kelly, and then I think we need to move on.
Just two kind of related things. One, I just wanted to ask if you're going to keep the unconstrained relationship elements in the metadata registry. And also, has there been any rethinking of the linking of particular relationship elements between agents and the WEMI stack? I know there's quite a few things related to expression in the current toolkit, such as costume designer and so forth, that it doesn't work very well in, say, the ripped model or the actors, where you have to keep putting it in every time with every new expression, or a sort of running issue of how screenwriter fits as a subtype of author.
Okay, I'm going to look at Gordon to make sure I have not said anything wrong, and I will know immediately from the dirty look he will give me. So the unconstrained properties, those will be in the registry. Yes, they will continue to be in the registry for those who have use of them. In terms of any specific questions about, relationship elements and at what level they belong, the RSC has, we had huge spreadsheets, so many spreadsheets. And, we looked at a lot of elements, and some of them we instantly realized, oh, this is all wrong. And we've made some changes there. Is it perfect? I'm sure it's not, because there's so many. So the work hasn't stopped. just because it's this way now doesn't mean it will always be this way. It could be something that's a post 3R development.
And that's certainly true in light of how aggregates and diachronic works, aggregates in particular, are being developed. We need to take a look at the relationship designators and their specificity in relationship to the ability to uniquely describe a segment of something. And then you could use sort of the higher level relationship. If you describe this screenplay, then the screenwriter is just an author. So we have to look at that in the greater context of what's happening post-3R. All right, thank you, Kate. The next presentation is from both Jamie and